hidden away in the charge and fight phases of Warhammer 40k are some of the most nuanced and tactical elements of the game. In this video, I go through some practical ways to use the extra movement we gain in these phases to our advantage and to increase the potency of our combat units. Hello and welcome to Incursion Tactics. Today I will be mostly talking about the charge and fight phase. In the last video I did on this, I encouraged us to think about these as additional movement phases, and to bring this to life I'm going to share some simple tactics that we can apply in our games. The last one in particular is a really easy zero effort way to improve the effectiveness of our units in almost any combat. Let's get started. This first scenario is quite a common one that comes up. We've got a unit of orc boys that want to charge a unit of bloodletters to give them a good grumping, and they also would like to get in combat with the plague bearers as well because they're standing there on an objective. The temptation in these scenarios is to simply go, I'm going to charge the plague bearers and I'm going to charge the bloodletters. It's a multi-charge, so when we roll our charge, we would need to roll the distance needed to get to the unit that's furthest away. In this case, the plague bearers are exactly 6 inches away. We would need to roll a 5 on the dice. At first glance, this feels like a no-brainer. It's only a 5. We're very likely to make it. The odds are significantly in our favour. Let's just charge in. Even though the units are very close together, this is quite a comfortable charge to make. There is a very real possibility that we could roll a 4, and if we haven't got a CP available to spend on a CP reroll, then we'd be scuppered. And even if we did have a CP, we might just fail the reroll anyway. It's taking a moment to think, how far away are we actually from the plague bearer unit? If we roll a charge into the bloodletters, maybe our natural charge move would get us close enough that we can just wander into them. If we only declare the bloodletters as a charge, we can see we've got a 2-inch gap, so we're guaranteed to make that charge no matter what we roll, even if we rolled really low. Let's go with we just rolled a 4, just shy of what we would have needed to make it into both units. First things first, we have to move all of the models that can get base-to-base contact with the enemy unit that we've declared a charge against, have to get to base-to-base contact. So that is the uppermost 5 orcs. But what we want to do in this scenario is get as many models as possible into both units. We want to get towards that plague bearer unit, we want to get towards that objective, whilst also getting in combat with the bloodletters. Bloodletters are quite fragile compared to the plague bearers, so we only need to get a modest amount of the orc boy unit into combat to be able to dispatch them. And so instead of moving the 5 units that would be eligible to be base to base with those bloodletter units, we're going to move one by one each of these orc models in such a way that they then block the remaining models that could make it into base to base contact. At first glance it looked like 5, but actually it might have even been 6, possibly even 7 with the 2 that are next to the nod there. It's academic. What we've done is we've blocked that off. Obviously, if we wanted to get as many models in base-to-base contact with the bloodletters as possible, we would shuffle along a little bit, make a big enough gap so we could get model number 5, 6 and 7 into base contact with those bloodletters, really make sure we deal with them, but that's not the objective here. As we've moved each model one by one, we've met the requirements. Can it make it base-to-base? Yes, we've done that. And in doing so, we've blocked the path of the rest of them, allowing them to move laterally towards the plague bearers. And where this is useful is, as we start to move the rest of that unit, we are closing the gap towards the plague bearers. Got enough movement, once we've moved all of these models, that we now should be within 3 inches of the plague bearers, so that when we go to fight, we'll be able to pile in, get in contact, and then add some attacks into the plague bearers as well. This might feel initially a little bit long-winded, why didn't we just charge? But in this scenario where we've rolled a 4, we've been able to get into contact with that plague bearer unit, whereas if we'd declared the charge against them, we literally would have failed that charge. And so this is a way to sneakily guarantee charges and not roll dice and make gambles that we don't have to do. Even if they seem like they're very likely to come off, we've avoided having to take that chance here. The other beauty of this maneuver is that as we start to pile in those orcs, we're able to get closer and closer towards that objective, put more OC onto the objective than the demons would have, and so guaranteeing that outcome of making that charge is going to have some really meaningful impacts on the game, because potentially taking some points away from our opponent as well. But one thing I will say is just to make sure you're being careful with the movement here, as in this scenario, the orc knob probably moved a little bit too close to the left. We have to make sure that we are moving our models closer to the closest enemy model as part of that pile-in move. So there is an element of freedom there, provided you end closer to the closest enemy model. You can kind of go in whatever direction you want, as long as you do that. So in this example here, probably moved a little bit too far to the left, and he wouldn't be able to get his attacks in there as desired. But if we can see we're not going to be able to make it base-to-base contact here, then at that point we just cut our losses and we move the orc knob into base-to-base with another model that's base-to-base with the bloodletters, or if he had enough movement, just get him in contact with the bloodletters himself, and that will be fine. The objective here was to get as many models as possible into combat with both units and as much OC onto that objective as possible, which we've achieved here. When the Orc Boys activate first, they should hopefully whittle down the OC of the Plague Bearers. Hopefully they should wipe the Bloodletters out and then be able to, with the 3-inch consolidate move, consolidate towards that objective and really add to the OC and take the objective away from the Plague Bearers. If they do start to take casualties, then they can start to remove models that are further away from the objective to ensure that they hold it. So a really simple initial scenario, but a couple of key takeaways there are to not declare additional charges or multi-charges if we don't need to. If it looks like we're going to have a reasonable chance of actually just wandering into combat with the combination of our charge roll and piling, then we don't need to gamble on making that charge. And also, even though we rolled a 4-inch charge, really maximising every inch of that free movement in order to get to where we need to be. We've been able to make it in contact with the Bloodletters, engineer the movement so we can veer towards the side and then really maximise that 3-inch pile in and consolidate to get into combat with the Plague Bearers, potentially kill them and really threaten that objective. We can really leverage that movement with a combination of careful placement of our own models to move block ourselves where we can so that we can steer the remainder of our unit in the direction that we want to go. Even in this scenario where we only rolled a 4, we were able to get quite far up the board, get into combat with those Plague Bearers, and with any luck we'd wipe out the Bloodletters and put a significant amount of OC onto that objective, securing it for the Orcs, even if we didn't actually manage to kill the Plague Bearers in the end, because I don't think that Orc Knob would have quite legally made it into that unit. Before we get on to the next tip, I do just want to share with you some awesome content creators, some friends of the channel, Epic Flail, Return to the Old World, and Bored Stupid. They all produce some great videos, and the links for their channels can be found in the description below. And now we're going to mix things up and have a little think about what we can do if we're charging 2 units. We've got a unit of Plague Bearers that have moved up and a unit of Bloodletters. Both units have set up a guaranteed charge by moving around 2 inches away from the Orc Boy unit. What's interesting about this setup is it exemplifies a situation that can come up quite frequently. We've got Plague Bearer unit reasonably tough to kill in combat, but not necessarily going to do massive amounts of damage when they actually make it into the charge. Bloodletter unit, which is very aggressive, can do quite a lot of damage when it charges in, but it can't take a lot of damage back, particularly from a unit like Orc Boys. If those Bloodletters charged in and the Orc Boy unit uses the counter-offensive stratagem, they will very likely wipe out that unit of Bloodletters before it gets to strike. So we've got to be very careful when we're charging in what unit we want to activate first in order to protect that Bloodletter unit. So the obvious solution is when we charge in with the Bloodletters, we'll strike with them first and then reduce the damage done on the counter-offensive. Makes a lot of sense, right? But before we even get to that point, there's another thing we can do to help protect both of our combat units even more than that, and it starts with the Plague Bearers declaring a charge. For the purpose of this, we're just going to assume the Plague Bearers roll an average charge roll of 7 inches. And you'll see here I'm measuring laterally, not just moving the closest model to the closest model. What I'm thinking about is how far along the line can I get each of the Plague Bearer unit. And because we move so close to the unit in the movement phase, we know that we're going to be able to get base to base with all of our Plague Bearer models. But the objective here is to try and tag as many different Orc models as we possibly can to prevent them from being able to pile in. And so when the Plague Bearers finish their charge move, they've managed to tag all but one of the Orc Boys. And now it's time for the Bloodletters to charge. And remember, this is the more fragile unit, so we want these models to be in contact with as few Orcs as possible. So we're going to get to base when we roll the charge move. Let's say that for argument's sake, the Bloodletters roll a really good charge of 12. They can go as far as they possibly like. In this scenario, we're actually going to do the opposite of what I've suggested before about maximising that movement we get on the charge rolls, because we don't want multiple Orc models in base contact with our Bloodletters. And so with a bit of careful placement, we can move each of them in such a way, place the first one, second, and the third, so that there's only a limited gap for the last couple to go. And even with that charge distance of 12, before we can place the final one, there'll be no way around either the Plague Bearers or the Bloodletters to be able to get through the other side and get base-to-base contact with another Orc. And by moving in this way, we reduce the number of attacks that the Orcs will be able to put into the Bloodletters. And so now we have a greater freedom to choose which unit we want to attack with first. If we hadn't pinned as many Orc Boys as we had with the Plague Bearers, after the Plague Bearers have fought, the Orc Boys could use counter-offensive to then pile in and attack the Bloodletters, probably wiping them out. And so as I mentioned before, we could strike first with the Bloodletters, and then that means that we'll do some damage to the Orcs and there'll be less to then strike back. But what if the Bloodletters don't do very well in combat? We are playing a dice game after all. They might whiff all their attacks, and even though we've done the sensible thing of striking first with the Bloodletters, now the Orc Boys can just still play the counter-offensive and do some serious damage to the Bloodletters and kill them. By charging in this way, we make it so that there's no good options, and what we can actually do is strike with the Plague Bearers first, whittle down some Orcs, and then if the Orcs want to spend 2 CP to interrupt, they're going to strike ahead of the Bloodletters. But is it really worth spending 2 CP to try and get one Orc boy attacking into the Bloodletters? Because they're not going to be able to pile in and get any more Orcs into that combat, and there's no point now spending 2 CP to go ahead of the Plague Bearers because they've just fought first, so there's no benefit to using the CP there. And so by doing this, we're playing around it. And I recommend striking in this scenario the way we've set it up with the Plague Bearers first, because if we strike with the Bloodletters, we might kill quite a lot, but then the Orc boys could then spend 2 CP to then strike ahead of the Plague Bearers and do some damage to the Plague Bearers, reduce some of the attacks that they then get from the Plague Bearers. So when we're charging in with multiple units into one target, we want to think about what we can get into base-to-base contact with that will then stop our opponents being able to move. We want to make sure that we're getting stuck in with the stuff that can take the hits more, like a unit of Plague Bearers, and only really getting into contact with as few models as possible with the other unit, limit the attacks back into the more fragile units, and also if we've managed to tag the unit across a different part of the battlefield, it locks them in place. That locking in place can also potentially prevent that unit from piling or consolidating onto an objective. So it's not only useful for ganging up and making sure we have a decisive combat that goes our way, it protects our own units, it also makes sure we can prevent the enemy from moving on to objectives. Lastly, I mentioned a real simple, low effort way of keeping our units at maximum fighting efficiency in the charge phase. And what we've got here is a unit of Storm Boys that are poised, ready to move and then charge into a unit of Plague Bearers. As you can see, they're about 12 inches away, plenty of movement to get them within a guaranteed charge range. So rather than just going directly in a straight line, what we're going to do is move up towards the edge of the battlefield and sit in a line like so. What this means is when the Orc boys inevitably charge, and let's say a decent charge roll of 12 inches, what we can do is make sure we're positioning the Orc boys one by one, so that again we're meeting the criteria of getting base to base with an enemy if we can, and staying in unit coherency. Because the Orc Storm boys have the fly keyword, they can go over enemy models as if they're not there when they're charging, and end the charge move like that. In doing this, we're only in base-to-base contact with 3 Plague Bearers, so when the Orc boys get to strike, they'll put all of their attacks in, do some damage to the unit, and when the Plague Bearer unit activates, as you can see, we're only going to be able to get the next 2 down to be in base-to-base contact with another model that's in base-to-base contact with the Storm boys, meaning that a total of 5 Plague Bearers at most can fight back into that Orc Storm Boy unit. If we compare moving the Storm Boy unit directly towards the Plague Bearers and then just charging straight in, like in this image here, we can see that when the Plague Bearers then pile in after the Orc boys have struck, they could potentially be receiving attacks from every single one of the Plague Bearers that were there, assuming none had died. Obviously in this scenario, the Orc boys would attack and potentially kill some Plague Bearers, reducing the number of models coming back. But what this hopefully does is illustrate that there's absolutely no point in getting any closer than you need to get into combat. As long as you've got all of your models into base contact or engagement range of one enemy model, it could all be the same or one little tiny group of enemy models within a unit, we'll be able to put all of our attacks into the enemy and they won't be able to put as much damage back into us. And this can make the difference between our units staying alive and getting absolutely wiped out. Imagine those Storm Boys go in, they do a reasonable amount of damage, then the Plague Bearers strike back. And because there's only 5 boys, maybe the Plague Bearers spike their attacks and kill them. But actually, if we've limited the amount of models that can strike back in the first place to a maximum of 5, all of a sudden it becomes very unlikely that the Plague Bearers can spike and wipe out that unit of Storm Boys. It's a real simple one, but between the desire to get onto objectives, the desire to get into combat and just get stuck in, and also sometimes I think people fall into a trap where they assume you've got to get as close as possible to the enemy because you're in combat, it feels thematic. Actually, no, we literally don't need to do that. As long as we're staying in unit coherency and we're getting base to base if we can, on a model by model basis, and we can move block ourselves to do that, to engineer all sorts of fun things. As long as we're doing that, then we're pretty much free to go whatever direction we want, as long as we're maintaining those things. And so I promise you, if you haven't been doing this before and you start implementing this in your combats, you'll begin to see very quickly a marked difference in the amount of damage you take back and how effective your units suddenly become, how much longer they're in the game for as you protect them from unnecessary damage. Hopefully you found this insightful. Obviously movement is a big part of the charge phase and the fight phase, and we should absolutely be thinking about how we can move within the limitations of the charge and the fight phase, and how we can make sure we're not falling into the pitfalls of things like counter-offensive that I mentioned earlier. That obviously plays a massive part in combat. I mentioned this in my first video about the charge and the fight phase, as well as how to avoid being overwatched off the table and how to play around heroic intervention. both of which also play a massive role in charging and how to get the most out of combat. So if you haven't yet seen that video, I thoroughly recommend you do so, because when we start to pair it up with what we've gone through here, we can really make the most out of the charge and the fight phase. We can create impactful one-sided combats where our opponents cannot interfere with our game plan, which is a really powerful thing to be able to do in an interactive dice game. And for the rest of the tactical videos that I've done, they can all be found here. In the meantime, keep rolling those dice. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.